Welcome to my channel. Subscribe to the channel and listen to my stories every day. It was a Saturday morning like any other. The kids were still asleep, the house was quiet, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the kitchen. As I leaned against the counter, I found myself savoring these rare moments of silence, a time when everything felt almost like it used to. That familiar warmth spread through me, the sense of a home well kept, a family united. But as I stirred my coffee, I couldn't shake off a feeling that had settled in my chest for weeks. Something wasn't right. Claire walked into the kitchen, and I watched her, noticing how she moved with a certain detachment. She glanced at me, then at the clock, then back to me. There was a hint of distance in her gaze that hadn't been there before. I'd seen that look before on other people but never on her. "I'm going out tonight," she said suddenly, barely looking up as she poured herself some coffee. "Oh. With who?" I tried to sound casual, but I knew my voice betrayed a hint of surprise. We didn't have a regular social circle. We were a couple who'd always preferred quiet evenings at home, family dinners, maybe an occasional night out together. So this was new. "Oh, just some old friends," she replied vaguely, brushing it off. "You know, we all need time to unwind." "Unwind? From what?" I asked, my tone edging on sarcasm. "From all the family time." She gave me a small, tight smile, one that looked almost forced. "Everyone needs a break now and then, don't you think?" There was something about her tone that felt like a challenge, a question she didn't need answered. "Yeah, I guess," I muttered, but inside, a whirlwind had started. That feeling, that ache in my chest, intensified as I watched her finish her coffee and leave the kitchen, barely giving me a second glance. I heard the shower start, the muffled sound of her humming under the running water, and for the first time, I felt like an outsider in my own house. My thoughts spiraled. Had something happened? Had I done something wrong? I replayed our last few months together, combing through each moment, each word, each subtle shift. I remembered our last family vacation, how she'd seemed almost detached the whole time, buried in her phone and hardly engaging with any of us. And now, here she was, going out with friends she'd never even mentioned before. Later that day, after the kids were up and the house filled with the usual Saturday bustle, I tried to shake off my unease. I focused on the small things, helping the kids with their chores, fixing up a few things around the house, running a couple of errands. Claire was in and out of the house, always seeming a bit rushed, a bit too busy. I caught her once, just standing by the window, staring out, her phone in her hand. She didn't even notice me watching her. She looked preoccupied, as if she were somewhere else entirely. By evening, I was practically counting down the hours, waiting for her to leave so I could finally confront the gnawing feeling in my gut. She stepped out of the bathroom in a dress I hadn't seen in years, one that hugged her in all the right places. She'd done her makeup too, subtle but striking, and she looked different, almost like the woman I'd fallen in love with years ago. But this version of her wasn't for me, that much was clear. As she gathered her things, she looked at me, her eyes flickering with something I couldn't quite place. "I'll be late," she said simply, as if that were all I needed to know. I nodded, forcing a smile. "Sure. Have a good time." It felt strange, saying those words when all I wanted to do was ask her what was going on, to demand an explanation for the changes that seemed so sudden, so alien. But instead, I let her go. As the door closed behind her, the silence in the house felt oppressive. The kids were already in bed, and I wandered around, trying to distract myself. I found myself going over to her car, almost instinctively. Her keys were still on the kitchen counter, she'd driven with a spare. I took them, went to her car, and opened the door, half expecting to find nothing, half hoping that I was just being paranoid. And that's when I saw it, a small, crumpled wrapper in the back seat. It wasn't a gum wrapper, not something innocent. No, this was something I never expected to find, something that sent my heart plummeting. I felt a tightness in my throat, a sickness churning in my gut. It was evidence, simple, stark, and undeniable. I felt numb. I sat there in the driver's seat, staring at that wrapper, as if it held some magical power, as if staring at it could somehow change what it meant, could rewrite the reality that was settling over me like a dark, heavy cloud. Claire wasn't just out with friends. There was someone else. Someone who had taken the place in her life, in her heart, that I thought was reserved for me. I barely slept that night, tossing and turning, with the image of that wrapper burned into my mind. The next morning, Claire acted as if everything were normal, laughing with the kids at breakfast, throwing me a casual smile, the perfect picture of a wife and mother. And yet, beneath her familiar exterior, there was a distance in her gaze that only deepened my resolve. Whatever was going on, I needed to know. I spent the day in a daze, moving through the motions, pretending I didn't notice the cracks in our life. Each time I saw her, I felt a surge of questions rise up, desperate to be asked, but something held me back. I wanted hard evidence, something concrete, before I confronted her. A part of me dreaded her reaction. What if I was right? And what if I wasn't? Later that night, after everyone was asleep, I sat down with her laptop. We had always trusted each other with our devices, even shared passwords. But as I logged in, I felt like I was crossing an invisible line, stepping into a part of her life she'd hidden from me. Her emails were filled with the usual stuff: work, family updates, a few messages from friends. But as I scrolled, I noticed a handful of recent emails from an unfamiliar name, a man named Nick. Most of them were short, seemingly harmless messages, quick confirmations about plans, casual comments, a few jokes. But then I hit one that was different, a message she'd kept buried in a separate folder. It was a simple line, but it felt like a punch to the gut: "Last night was amazing. I can't wait to see you again." I read it over and over, hoping I'd misinterpreted it, that there was some other explanation. But each time, the words stared back at me, cold and unyielding. I sat there, numb, staring at the screen, my mind racing. I felt a surge of anger, mixed with disbelief. How long had this been going on? What else was she hiding from me? I kept going, digging deeper, until I found what I feared most: a whole trail of messages, some going back months. Plans for secret meetings, discussions about work that turned into flirtation, confessions of excitement and desire. Each word felt like another betrayal, a wound reopening with every line. I didn't want to read more, but I couldn't stop. I shut the laptop, my heart pounding. My hands were shaking, and I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. Everything in me wanted to storm upstairs, to wake her and demand answers. But I knew that wasn't the way. I needed time to think, to plan my next steps. She wouldn't get off that easily. The following days were a blur. I went through the motions, pretending nothing was wrong, while the knowledge of her betrayal simmered beneath the surface. I watched her closely, every smile, every laugh, wondering how much of it was a lie. I replayed our life together, every shared moment, every promise. All of it felt tainted now. On Thursday, I took a day off from work, telling her I needed to catch up on a few things around the house. As soon as she left, I grabbed my phone and started making calls. I reached out to an attorney first, someone I'd heard about from a friend who had gone through a divorce. She came highly recommended, and after hearing my story, she didn't hesitate. "This is all too common, unfortunately," she said with a hint of sympathy. "You need to start documenting everything. Every text, every email, every piece of evidence. Make sure you have it all in order." "What about the kids?" I asked, my voice shaking. She hesitated. "It's always tough when children are involved. But the more prepared you are, the better your chances will be to secure what's best for them. Have a support system ready. And don't confront her until you have everything lined up." I spent the rest of the day gathering everything I could, creating a folder filled with the emails, the text messages I'd managed to intercept, photos I'd taken of that damned rapper in her car. Each piece felt like a knife, but I pushed through, reminding myself that I needed this, that I had to be ready when the time came. By Saturday night, I had everything prepared. The attorney had advised me to hold off on any direct confrontation until she'd set things in motion on her end, but I knew I couldn't wait much longer. The anger and betrayal boiled within me, each day harder to keep the charade up, to act as if I didn't know what she was doing. That evening, as we sat in the living room watching TV, I found myself stealing glances at her, studying her face, wondering how she could sit here so calmly, so at ease, knowing what she was doing to us. I caught her looking at her phone, smiling at a text that I couldn't see, and my stomach churned. It took everything in me not to snatch the phone from her hands, to expose her right then and there. But I stayed silent, gripping the armrest so hard my knuckles went white. When she finally went upstairs to bed, I stayed back, my mind racing. I knew I couldn't wait much longer. This had to end, one way or another. I'd held back long enough. The next morning, I woke up with a strange sense of calm, a clarity that had been missing all week. I couldn't continue living like this, couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. I needed to confront her, to hear her side, even if it tore me apart. That afternoon, while the kids were at a friend's house, I called her into the living room. She looked surprised, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, guilt, maybe, or fear. She sat down across from me, and I could see her hands fidgeting, her gaze shifting. "What's going on?" she asked, trying to sound casual. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "I know about you and Nick," I said, keeping my voice as steady as I could. Her face went pale, her eyes widening. For a moment, she looked like she was about to deny it, but then her shoulders slumped, and she looked away, unable to meet my gaze. I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Sorry?" I echoed, feeling a surge of anger. "That's all you have to say?" She looked at me then, her eyes filled with tears. "It just happened," she said, her voice cracking. "I didn't plan it. I never wanted to hurt you." I laughed, a bitter sound that filled the silence between us. "You didn't want to hurt me? Claire, you've been lying to me, sneaking around behind my back. You've been betraying me and our kids." She covered her face with her hands, sobbing softly, and for a brief moment, I felt a pang of pity. But it was fleeting. All I could see was the betrayal, the lies, the selfishness. "I want you to leave," I said, my voice cold. She looked up, shock and panic in her eyes. "Please. I can't. I don't have anywhere to go." "That's not my problem," I replied, standing up. "I gave you everything, Claire. I trusted you, built a life with you. And this is what you did with it." She reached out, trying to grab my hand, but I pulled away. "Please," she begged, tears streaming down her face. "Please, let me stay. I'll do anything." But I knew there was no going back. She'd made her choice. And now, it was time for me to make mine. I stood there, staring down at Claire, feeling a strange numbness seep through me. Her tear-streaked face, the look of desperation in her eyes, none of it moved me the way it once might have. She had made her choices. She had decided to lie, to betray, to take what we had and shatter it. Now, she was watching as the consequences closed in. The silence between us stretched, thick and unyielding. She sat on the couch, her shoulders shaking, her gaze fixed on the floor as if she were too ashamed to look me in the eye. And in that silence, a realization struck me: this wasn't just her mistake. It was the end of something I had believed was unbreakable. "You need to leave," I repeated, my voice harder now, my anger simmering just below the surface. "I don't want you here anymore." "But, what about the kids?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "The kids are with me," I said, crossing my arms. I'm not going to let them be affected by this, Claire. You've already done enough. She looked up, her eyes pleading. Please, we can work this out. I'll do anything. I made a mistake, a terrible, horrible mistake. But don't take them from me. Her words barely registered. I had made my decision, and I knew it was the only way forward. There was no fixing this, no going back to the way things were. The person I thought she was, the life we'd built, it was all just an illusion, and I'd been the fool who'd believed it. You know what's funny? I said, unable to keep the bitterness from my voice. I thought we were a team. I thought we'd get through anything together. But I guess you decided that wasn't enough for you. She shook her head, the desperation in her eyes deepening. It was a mistake. I was lost, and he was there, and I don't know. I can't explain it. But I love you. I love our family. I never wanted to hurt you. Her words sounded hollow, and I couldn't bring myself to believe them. You don't get to claim love after everything you've done, I said, my voice cold and sharp. Love isn't sneaking around, lying to someone you promised to be loyal to. Love isn't what you did. Claire looked away, her face crumpling. For a moment, I almost pitied her. Almost. But the anger, the betrayal, was too much. I couldn't soften now, not after everything. I'll give you a few days to get your things together, I said, keeping my tone steady. After that, I want you out. I don't want you around me, and I don't want you around the kids unless it's supervised. She nodded, her gaze fixed on the floor. It was as if she'd accepted her fate, realizing that there was no way to undo what she'd done. I watched her, feeling nothing but a cold satisfaction. She'd torn apart our life, and now she'd have to live with the consequences. The days that followed were a blur. Claire tried to reach out to me, to talk, but I avoided her at every turn. I couldn't bear to look at her, to listen to her excuses, her attempts to justify what she'd done. I had no interest in her explanations or her apologies. They felt like empty words, meaningless sounds that only served to remind me of how deeply she had betrayed me. The kids, thankfully, seemed unaware of the tension that had gripped our home. I did my best to keep things as normal as possible, to shield them from the unraveling marriage that lay just beneath the surface. But as each day passed, I felt the weight of my decision settling on my shoulders, a mixture of relief and sadness that threatened to overwhelm me. On Claire's final night in the house, I sat alone in the living room, a glass of whiskey in my hand. The house was quiet, the kids already asleep. Claire had retreated to the guest room, packing the last of her belongings. The silence felt heavy, oppressive, filled with memories that lingered like ghosts. I thought about our wedding day, the promises we'd made, the life we'd built together. It was strange, realizing how easily everything could crumble, how a single betrayal could erase years of love and trust. I took a sip of whiskey, feeling its warmth spread through me, dulling the ache that had taken up residence in my chest. It wasn't long before Claire came downstairs, a hesitant look on her face. She stood in the doorway, watching me, her eyes filled with regret. I'm leaving tomorrow, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't respond, just kept staring at the empty space in front of me. I need you to know that I'm sorry, she continued, her voice breaking. I know that doesn't mean much now, but I am. I'm so sorry. I looked up at her, meeting her gaze for what felt like the first time in days. Sorry doesn't change anything, I said, my voice flat. Sorry doesn't fix what you've done. She nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. I know. With that, she turned and walked away, leaving me alone in the silence once again. I listened to her footsteps fade up the stairs, the sound echoing in the emptiness of the house. The next morning, Claire left before the kids woke up. I watched from the window as she loaded her things into the car, a sense of finality settling over me. She paused before getting in, looking back at the house as if trying to memorize it, as if she were saying goodbye to a life she'd taken for granted. And then she was gone. The days that followed were a strange mix of relief and sorrow. I threw myself into my routine, focusing on the kids, my work, anything that would keep me busy, keep my mind from drifting back to the memories of what we'd once had. I wasn't sure how to feel. Part of me was glad to be free of her lies, her betrayal. But another part of me, a deeper part, felt the loss in ways I couldn't fully articulate. The kids noticed her absence, of course. They asked questions, wondering where she was, why she hadn't come home. I did my best to explain, to reassure them that everything would be okay. It was difficult, trying to balance honesty with the need to protect them from the harsh reality of their mother's actions. But I managed, somehow, and in time, their questions began to fade. One night, a few weeks later, as I sat alone in the quiet of the house, I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. The anger, the betrayal, the hurt, it was still there, lingering beneath the surface. But it didn't consume me like it once had. I had made my decision. I had done what I needed to do, not just for myself, but for my kids, for the life I wanted to build without her. And as I sat there, the memories of our past drifting through my mind, I realized that I was finally ready to let go. I didn't need her apologies, her excuses, her attempts at redemption. I didn't need anything from her anymore. I was free. Weeks passed, and I adjusted to life without Claire. Each day brought a sense of clarity and a freedom I hadn't known in years. I'd poured my energy into the kids and my work, making sure they felt secure. The kids were resilient, adapting quickly. Their laughter filled the house again, and I realized that while Claire's absence had left a void, it wasn't one that couldn't be healed. Then, one evening, a letter arrived. It was in an envelope with no return address, placed directly in our mailbox. I stared at it, turning it over in my hands, a sense of unease prickling at my spine. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but something compelled me to open it right there, on the front porch. Inside was a short note, written in a precise, almost clinical handwriting. I thought you should know the truth about Claire's affair. It's not what you think. You should have all the facts before making any final decisions. Meet me tomorrow at 7 p.m. at the Parkside Cafe if you want answers. There was no name, just those words, stark and direct. I reread it, my mind spinning. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to toss the letter aside and move on. But another part, a part one couldn't ignore, wanted to know more. What truth was there to uncover? What hadn't I already seen in the messages, the evidence I'd found? The next evening, I found myself driving to the Parkside Cafe. I didn't know what to expect. I parked across the street, my mind filled with possibilities, questions I hadn't dared to consider. When I walked in, the cafe was mostly empty, save for a single figure sitting at a table near the back. It was Nick. He looked up as I approached, a mix of nervousness and something that almost resembled relief in his eyes. I recognized him from a photo I'd once seen on Claire's phone. The man who had destroyed my marriage, who had taken what I'd thought was mine. Every instinct in me wanted to turn around and leave, but I forced myself to sit down, my face a mask of calm. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice low. "What do you want, Nick?" I asked, my tone cold. "And why should I listen to anything you have to say?" He glanced down at his coffee, then back up at me, his gaze steady. "Because I think you deserve to know the truth." "The truth?" I almost laughed, bitterness heavy in my voice. "I know the truth, Nick. I've seen the messages. I know what happened." "You know part of it," he said quietly. "But there's more. A lot more." I stayed silent, my jaw clenched, waiting for him to continue. "Claire and we did have an affair," he admitted, his voice shaking slightly. "But it wasn't what you think. I didn't mean for it to happen, and neither did she. We'd met through work, and at first, it was just friendship. She was going through a rough time. What kind of rough time? I interrupted, my tone sharp. I gave her everything she needed. We had a family, a home, stability. What more could she possibly want? He took a deep breath. She never told you, did she? Told me what? He looked away, struggling to find the words. Claire has cancer. My heart stopped. I stared at him, waiting for the punchline, the twist that would make this all a sick joke. But his expression was somber, filled with an emotion I couldn't place. She found out a few months ago, he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. She didn't want to tell you, didn't want to put you or the kids through it. She'd been undergoing treatments in secret, trying to manage it on her own. She was scared, overwhelmed, and she made some bad choices. I felt the world tilting beneath me, the room spinning as I tried to process his words. Why wouldn't she tell me? I'm her husband. I had a right to know. She said she couldn't bear to burden you, to see you look at her with pity or fear. She thought she could handle it on her own. He paused, looking down at his hands. She told me she didn't want you to remember her as weak or sick. She wanted to protect you. I sat there, stunned, the anger draining from me, replaced by a hollow ache. Claire had been facing this alone, keeping this secret from me, all the while trying to act as if everything were normal. And in the middle of her pain, her confusion, she had turned to Nick. We didn't plan for things to go that way, he said, his voice filled with regret. She just needed someone to talk to, someone who knew. It was stupid, reckless, but it wasn't meant to hurt you. I felt my hands tremble, memories flashing before me, moments when Claire had seemed distant, distracted, moments I had dismissed as ordinary stress or fatigue. And all the while, she'd been fighting a battle I hadn't even known existed. Where is she now? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Nick hesitated. She's staying with her sister. She didn't know I'd be contacting you. But I felt you deserved to know the truth. I sat there, a storm of emotions raging inside me. Part of me wanted to scream at him, to blame him for everything. But another part, the part that understood the weight of his words, couldn't muster the anger. All I felt was an overwhelming sense of sorrow, of loss, for the woman I had thought I knew, for the life we had shared. Thank you, I said quietly, rising from the table. For telling me. Nick nodded, looking as though he wanted to say more, but I turned and walked out of the cafe, my mind reeling. When I got home, the kids were asleep. The house felt empty, silent, filled with memories of a life I was no longer sure I understood. I sat down at the kitchen table, staring at the faint glow of the streetlight through the window, and for the first time in weeks, I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. Claire had been trying to protect us, to keep us safe from the reality she was facing. She'd made mistakes, hurt me in ways that felt almost impossible to forgive. But beneath it all, there was a love I had taken for granted, a depth of sacrifice that I hadn't seen until now. The next morning, I made a decision. I drove to her sister's house, my hands gripping the wheel, my heart pounding. I didn't know what I was going to say, but I knew that this wasn't over. Not yet. When I knocked on the door, it opened slowly, and there she was, pale, thinner than I remembered, with a fragility that tore at my heart. Her eyes widened in surprise, and for a moment, we just stood there, neither of us speaking. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice breaking. I thought I was doing the right thing. I didn't want you to see me like this. I stepped forward, taking her hands in mine, feeling the weight of everything unsaid between us. We promised to be there for each other, I said softly, looking into her eyes. No matter what. I'm not leaving, Claire. I'm here. For you. For the kids. For us. She broke down, sobbing, and I held her, feeling a sense of peace settle over me, a fragile peace, but a peace nonetheless. Whatever the future held, we would face it together. She had hurt me, betrayed me, but in her own way, she had been trying to protect me from a pain she couldn't bear to share. In that moment, I knew that love was not just in the easy times, in the joy and laughter, but in the willingness to fight through the darkest moments, to forgive even the deepest wounds. And as I held her, I knew that I had found a strength within me that I hadn't known existed, a strength to rebuild, to heal, and to love again.